Okay, so thanks for joining us, everybody. We've got a bunch of papers this morning, so to give everybody their due share, I'm going to hop right into it. Lane Vanderslice will be our first presenter. Okay, you're up, Lane.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Can you hear me?
They can hear you, but you won't be able to know they hear you.
Okay, fine. That's good. Well, the title of my talk is, first of all, let me say I'm very happy to be here, and I know it's a difficult time for everybody, but it's a real pleasure that this has been able to work out, that we could do this. I think it is valuable. The title of my talk is, Does Orthodox Economics Understand the Economics of Harm? If you have to get somewhere in a hurry, the short answer is no, but I'm going to take a bit longer to develop it. Orthodox economics understands productive activity, which obtains income by benefiting others. But unlike Marxist economics, it does not have an adequate conception of income activity which obtains income by harming others. There's a broad and important range of activities which obtain income by harming others. I will take a look at some of these in just a minute. What needs to be studied is not only productive activities, but also harmful ones. Not only a productive economic system, but a productive plus harmful economic system, including political, economic, and social components, where the interaction is much different than that put forward in Orthodox economics. Harm is not a term in much in use in economics. I'm using it to enable us to see the commonality in a variety of terms in Orthodox and heterodox economics. Marxist economics would refer to it as exploitation and oppression. And productive plus harmful systems over the last couple centuries as capitalism. This paper first looks at what Orthodox and non-Marxist heterodox economists have said about harm, utilizing Orthodox economic theory. Secondly, the paper looks at to what extent this analysis of harm gets incorporated into Orthodox economic textbooks. We must look at what is being transmitted to a new generation of students and what this says about Orthodox economics. Using this criterion, I would say that understanding harm will require significant expansion and change of Orthodox economics, one where heterodox economists have an important role to play. Let's look at the definition of harm. The idea of harm presented here is that of James Taylor in the Journal of Economic Issues. One group uses resources to restructure the alternatives of a second group in such a way that the first group benefits. This restructuring reduces the value of the opportunities available to the second group. The set of opportunities facing some individuals in a system with harm is different, providing less opportunity than a system completely composed of productive activities. Slavery provides an undesirable life of compulsion and confinement to induce slaves to produce value greater than what they receive. These structures can be principally in economic, political, or social spheres, and very often actions in each sphere are coordinated and strengthening each other. Now for the major section of the paper, let's consider important areas of harm that are in fact addressed in Orthodox economics. The first one would be monopoly and market power. Certainly the type of harm best understood by Orthodox economics is market power. Monopolists can use market power to raise prices, providing monopoly income without providing a service. In fact, by reducing production. Other types of market power, such as oligopoly and monopoly, obtain income by reducing the benefit to others. The second one would be use of cost-benefit analysis to measure conditions of work and other sources of harm. Situations where harm was being done, and is being done, such as worker safety and health, workers' bargaining rights, environmental harm, and product safety, have been raised to the level of political action against them by social movements. These harms are now addressed in Orthodox economics using cost-benefit analysis. The third one would focus on, try to understand harm, is game theory. Game theory can address situations where differential power can extract a reward for the stronger. Conflict theory, a subfield, addresses this in a way very specific to Orthodox economics. Jack Hirschheifer, one of the founders of this subfield, recognized that there are two main approaches to obtaining income: production and conflict. Conflict means using resources to take away from another party. The key point is this: when two parties produce, the production is additive. Conflict, however, has a winner, and the winner's gain comes from the loser. Nonetheless, in spite of this subfield, Orthodox economics does not treat conflict as an integral part of economics. Conflict expenditures are viewed as national defense and consequently productive expenditure, and defense expenditures are discussed as examples of public goods, which, while true, sidesteps the necessary discussion of conflict, which is in fact used to shape outcomes in the real world, and which involves substantial amounts of harm. Conflict, even narrowly defined, is an important activity. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute estimates world military expenditure in 2019 as 2.2% of global production. The drastic worsening of people's lives is another major source of harm from conflict. For example, at the end of 2019, approximately 1 out of every 100 people worldwide were forcibly displaced as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, or human rights violations. Rent seeking is, I think, the fourth strand of Orthodox economics theory, analyzing unproductive activities that obtain income. It focuses mainly on the sphere of government action. As with conflict theory, there is unproductive activity which does receive income, and there is a cost in carrying it out. Transparency's International's analysis of corruption is related. Transparency International defines corruption as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. The Corruption Perception Index ranks 180 countries according to according to the perception. According to the perception of corruption in the public sector, with a scale of 0, highly corrupt, to 100, very clean. More than 2/3 of the countries score below 50. It is fair to say that corruption is significant in most countries of the world. A fifth aspect is economic history. Some economists writing on history from an Orthodox economic perspective have also considered societies which have central and essential elements of harm. These writers include ASSA, Mogul, and Robinson, and North Wallace and Weingast. Both groups have described, Both groups have described very well what we call a productive plus harmful economic system. North Wallace and Weingast use the term limited access order or natural state. Quoting here from them, a natural state forms a dominant coalition that limits access to valuable resources, land, labor, capital, or access to and control of valuable activities, such as trade, worship, and education, to elite groups. The creation of rents through limiting access provides the glue that holds the coalition together, enabling elite groups to make credible commitments to one another to support the regime, perform their functions, and refrain from violence, end quote. They estimate that limited access orders have about 85% of the world's population. Both sets of authors distinguish a second group of countries that has emerged: an open access order for North Wallace and Weingast, and inclusive for ASSA, Mogul, and Robinson, with about 15% of the world's population, those that live in developed countries. Freedom in the World, Freedom House annual report on political rights and civil liberties, addresses the same topic. 43% of the countries of the world are evaluated as free, while 57% are classified either as not free, 25%, or partly free, 32%. Another major area, which is where harm has been standard in Orthodox economics, is discrimination and group inequality. William Darity Jr. and others have just developed stratification economics to understand racial and other equality. Right. And Alyssa Bronstein has developed patriarchal rent seeking to understand gender inequality. Stratification economics considers that societies are hierarchical. There is a dominant group and a subordinate group in society. The dominant group can restrict access to jobs, education, housing, social circles, and other advantages, resulting in significant harm to the subordinate group. Orthodox discrimination theory, focusing on human capital explanations and to a lesser extent the taste for discrimination, does not capture the importance of such stratification. Bronstein says, quote, patriarchal rent seeking affords better insight into the puzzle of why gender hierarchies persist. While the exercise of power and maintenance of the social institutions that support that power may be costly from a social perspective, to the extent that patriarchy benefits a hegemonic group, institutional change will be slow in coming, end quote. Heterodox, there have been a substantial number of heterodox contributions to all of this, including the following. Dean Baker considers that growth in rents has played a key role in the growth of inequality in the US economy. I'll just shorten this a bit to make sure I end up pretty close on time. Eileen,
you're at about 5 minutes right now, Lane.
Okay. Well, then let me just pass over those and get to the other two parts so I can do it. But certainly Applebaum, Biesemer, and Hudson, and Lazanik, and Shin have done important work in this area. So harm, and let me turn to the next section, which is harm in economics texts. To what extent do economics, now we want to see, though economists have done this, to what extent has this been incorporated in what's being passed on in the theory text? Price theory and public economics texts would be the key places to look. In price theory texts, the two types of harm described here that are well covered in price theory texts are market power in both product and factor markets, and game theory. Though game theory can be used to show harm, the textbook treatments of price game theory do not do this. An important point to make is that a general unproductive activity that obtained income is not discussed as a general category in price theory, nor its implications for a market economy. Another, in public economics text, structures of harm are present in the political and social structures as well. Orthodox economics texts consider the political sphere principally in public economics text. Sorry. In Orthodox public economics texts, the government is treated as democratic. Major expenditure and policy decisions are carried out by voting. The major obstacle to carrying out the wishes of the people is the paradox of voting. Yet, as we have seen above, only a minority of the governments can be considered as free. What is going on here? If Orthodox economics texts are focusing on the United States and other developed countries because that's where their audience lives, that's a profound mistake. Science describes what is happening, not a comfortable subset of reality. Throughout history, including the present, a principal government activity is controlling people. Whether this is benign or not is not discussed in public economic text. Is this control to ensure people's freedoms or to maintain oligarchic elite control of government society? Not discussed either, and this is an important point, are the ways and extent to which elite priorities can be maintained in a system such as the United States, which is both nominally and significantly democratic. Conflict is not really discussed at all. National defense is discussed as a government good in response to potential harm, but conflict as harm to gain benefits is not discussed. Since discrimination is not viewed as a central economic issue, discrimination is not discussed. nor government's role in maintaining discrimination, reducing discrimination, or both simultaneously according to the particular government considered, nor is occupational health and safety, environmental protections, or worker bargaining rights. I believe that a substantial portion of government activities in societies where government democracy has gained some ascendancy over oligarchy is protection against harm. This should be brought out in the government economics text and is not. In conclusion, let me make just 3 final points briefly. It is essential to see the different types of harm as part of a broader category. I have called it harm in this paper, but others have referred to it variously as conflict, rent-seeking, exploitation, oppression, extractive political and economic institutions, or predatory value extraction. While these terms have tended to focus on particular types of harm, they can be used to describe harm more generally. Once we have a more general term, we can see the important commonalities, such as obtaining income, though it's not productive activity. Marxist economists might question the need. Secondly, Marxist economists might question the need for including harm in orthodox economics, since exploitation and oppression have been included in Marxist economics from the beginning. There is something to be said for this position. It is true that very little progress has been made in incorporating harm into orthodox economics. Nonetheless, orthodox economics has a framework to consider harm. It is simply not doing so. Finally, harm is a fundamental part of how income is obtained. You cannot have economics without considering it adequately. Students are injured by learning a subject which is not properly describe reality. I believe that including harm into standard economic analysis will lead to insights that will help everyone understand harm better. For example, exploitation harm does not depend on the labor theory of value. Harm is a natural way of obtaining income, which has been important for millennia. Reducing harm has been a central part of the struggle for freedom over the centuries until today. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much, Lane, for being exactly right on time. That was great. So for people who are coming in, I'm keeping an eye on our attendees, and they've been going up. So people are coming in. We're going to go through all the papers, and then we'll have time at the end for Q&A. And so in order to keep things moving quickly, I'm going to hop right over to Eric. Eric, is Sarah there with you, or are you presenting on your own?
Just myself, yeah.
Okay, awesome. So Lane, if you could stop sharing your screen, and then it'll allow Eric to get his material up, and I'll turn it over to him. Okay, thanks so much. Okay, Lane, up at the top of your screen, if you hover a little bit, there should be a bar to allow you to stop sharing the screen. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Eric, you should be able to screen share now. Okay, great. Thanks so much.
Okay. Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Glad we could do this at least virtually. Hope everyone is safe. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about unemployment insurance and kind of looking at both history and where we are going forward. Obviously, unemployment insurance has been a big part of the coronavirus recession. The U.S. has spent far more than it ever has on unemployment insurance in the last 12 months. And there's ongoing debates about that policy and how it works, how it's implemented, etc. So first thing to note, I'm sure you've seen some of this, but it's kind of interesting to look at it compared to the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009, where we had obviously significant unemployment from that perspective. And obviously with the coronavirus, unemployment was at a record high, really not ever seen in modern history, at least, with initial claims of over 7 million weekly. Obviously that came down substantially in the summer and fall, although it's notably ticking up again now. But even after the big drop off from the spring period, still it was at a record high. So unemployment, offices were overwhelmed with claims and all kinds of other administrative issues as well. Oops, there we go. So I want to talk a little bit about a little history here because I think it's useful to understand because a lot of the issues are the same in many ways. So in the 19th century and early 20th century, under US and British law, basically there was this idea of, in British law, there was actually, there was some advantages for the employee in terms of the employment relationship. You could not simply be terminated at will. There was some need for a notice of termination under the so-called master-servant laws in Britain. So they didn't per se have unemployment at the time, but they did have sort of some legal protections for employees in certain conditions, at least under certain conditions. In the US, on the other hand, there's a gentleman, Horace Gray Wood, who's an attorney in Albany, New York, who wrote a treatise in 1875 that actually established employment at will. It's kind of interesting because Mr. Wood was not really a well-known attorney per se, but basically his treatise became essentially standard US law all the way up to the Supreme Court, basically meaning either side could terminate the relationship at will or at a moment's notice, outside of some explicit employment contract, which was unusual. So basically from the 1870s on in the US, it became codified as employment at will. Obviously, given the power of employers, especially at that time in the Gilded Age, the employee was clearly at a disadvantage, even though technically both sides had the same legal authorities. In 1913, Charles Labatt, who was a law professor, wrote another treatise that basically stated this, that Wood's rule was law of the land. And what the courts had decided at the time was that employees did not have a property interest in their job, basically meaning you could be terminated, you didn't have any interest in maintaining that position. Again, unless you had an explicit employment contract, which was quite rare, more common for highly paid employees. Unemployment insurance comes in as an idea as early as the 1890s, but really doesn't get any legal traction until the 1930s. So we have about a 30-year period where people are talking about this, debating this, but ultimately not much is happening. In the 1930s, we do finally get unemployment insurance, which essentially adds a new cost to the employer when they do terminate someone under certain conditions. And that sort of changed, to some extent, the nature of the employee-employer relationship. So what we have then, kind of in the 20s, 30s, a little bit earlier in Britain, in Germany, Northern Europe, Denmark, apologies for the misspelling there, Switzerland and Belgium, there's some early municipal level unemployment programs that are more voluntary in nature. And then in Great Britain, you have the National Insurance Act of 1911 and the Unemployment Insurance Act of 1920, which essentially established what would be some kind of modern unemployment, although quite a different system than the US would ultimately have. One of our founders, John Commons, obviously was very influential in getting the Unemployment Insurance Act of 1932 passed in the state of Wisconsin. This policy is quite different in some ways than what we have today. And at the time, we'll talk a little bit about what Commons was thinking. And I think even he recognized that this was a first step and not really the ultimate way the system would probably be able to operate. It was clear when, even before FDR's election, that the current systems were not working. And so in 1935, after a lot of debate and discussion, again, some of the early institutional economists heavily involved in this, Title IX of the Social Security Act was introduced, which created a federal state system for unemployment insurance. And this is important because really no other country has a system like this where the states are essentially really the ones doing the system. The federal government is essentially incentivizing states to create an unemployment insurance program. And the federal government is helping fund it, although I have to say pretty minimally ultimately. So basically it's a state-run system with federal support, whereas in most countries it's a national system. This Title IX Act was written by some of Common's students, including Elizabeth Brandeis and her husband, Paul. So they have an entire book on their unemployment experience and how that played out. So Commons obviously wrote a lot about unemployment in his institutional economics book and a number of articles in the American Labor Legislative Review. But his view is very specific. Business is responsible for unemployment. They're responsible for the employment relationship in general. Therefore, they should assist in stabilizing employment, because ultimately workers and even the state in the sense of the government does not control employment per se. So Commons was really pushing on the idea that really we had to make sure it was the employer who was dealing with this unemployment problem. Whereas in Britain, it was not really thought of in that sense. It was really seen as social insurance, that the government was really responsible for providing coverage. So now Commons did recognize in his writings in the early 30s that basically long-term unemployment was going to be an issue. And in fact, he even recognized at the time in the 1930s that this unemployment program he was putting in place in Wisconsin was not going to really solve the depression level problems, that this was probably more of a long-term policy for more quote unquote normal times. There was also the need for public employment offices. So we sometimes forget about the administration of a policy is as important as getting the policy actually passed. And there was a statistic I saw that in Britain, there were over 1,000 employment offices in the 1930s for the entire country. And in the US, there was only 200. And obviously, given geography and population, there's a massive inadequacy in the US system. And that actually inadequacy even today is a problem still, if you compare Britain or Europe to the United States. So just to give you a context, there's really two types of unemployment programs you can have. And the US system is, of course, in many cases, the US has policies that are very unique to the US. And that's pretty much true here as well. The Employer Reserve Program is the Commons Wisconsin idea. That was contrasted to the pooled program of Isaac Rubinow in what they call the Ohio system. So in the common system, just to kind of give you a brief snapshot, the employer is taxed and the proceeds are used to pay unemployment benefits for specific employees. So essentially the idea is you're tying that if I unemploy someone, I am then responsible for paying the person's wages. And the idea is obviously to prevent unemployment, right? The goal of the policy really is that we wouldn't ultimately pay out that much, because the idea was to raise the cost of unemploying someone. Now there's a lot of details to the system about merit ratings and, new employers have certain, things they get because they're new and so forth. And there's a lot of details. The other big part of the US system that's unique, because again, it's a state-run system, is you have wide disparities in what's actually provided, whether it's the level of benefit, the duration of the benefit, and so forth. During the pandemic, we had some extraordinary conditions so that some of the benefits were uniform because those were federal benefits. But generally speaking, you have wide disparities in what's provided in the US system. In the Ohio idea, which really is what Britain has and what most of the rest of the world has, is you're just using general taxation to pay for the system. The nature of the tax system then becomes important, because that depends on whether it's a progressive or regressive tax system, on who's actually paying for these benefits. Generally, there's more of a flat rate type benefit paid out. There are still duration factors and eligibility issues. But again, the goal here is more social insurance as opposed to preventing unemployment. And so that's rough. I mean, the details matter a lot, quite frankly, and I'm being pretty generic here, but that's kind of roughly the two ideas. So the problems are obvious.
Just over 5 minutes.
Okay. Both pre and post pandemic, you have, as I said, long-term unemployment because of duration clauses of how long. Excluded workers like gig workers and the self-employed have generally been excluded. Multi-earning families is an issue because often only one member of the family may be eligible. And like I said, limited benefits in many states. So the CARES Act, both the first and second one, the second one that just passed recently, provided for federal unemployment relief of $600 weekly for a certain time period. The state had to agree to this. I believe all states did. It also extended eligibility. It included benefits for self-employed workers, which was new. But all these changes are temporary. They're not permanent. So again, we're going to have the same issues once all this is undone. I should know Congress has appropriated over $600 billion in unemployment insurance in 2020, essentially. Some of that will be in 2021. Compare that to the Great Recession, we only spent about $150 billion roughly. So a massive increase from what we spent even 10 years ago. Obviously, Commons wants us to think about reasonable value. He's maybe sometimes considered a more conservative reformer. So, you know, he would want us to see how do we resolve this maybe pragmatically, incrementally. Do we have alternatives we can look at that exist in reality, and so forth, and reasonable, meaning it's going to kind of be the interest of many different parties. This is one way to look at it, not certainly the only way by any means. I think in the 21st century, employment at will is still generally what exists in the United States. However, labor union policy still matters and collective bargaining. And so in some areas where that still exists, that obviously dictates over the employment at will relationship. Now, the courts have chipped away at this. Employees do have causes of action where they can sue for wrongful discharge under some conditions, whether it be racial or sexual discrimination, things of that nature. Now, obviously, that often can put the burden on the employee to engage in legal costs. There is some statutory protection for mass layoff notices. But again, the US is pretty far behind in many of these areas. I think there's pressure to change these working rules, as Commons would term it. The recession and the pandemic have exposed really these problems once and for all, that unemployment simply isn't a good measure anymore of economic progress. The unemployment insurance is inadequate in many cases. Even the administration of the program has been very problematic in terms of getting money to people. That was true in 2008. It's even more true in 2020. There are at least three policy options that I can see. One is you can modify UI in some ways, and this might be the more pragmatic approach. You can change the employer-employee legal relationship in some pretty dramatic and important ways, or you could simply guarantee employment or income. And we certainly don't have time to look at all of the potential advantages and disadvantages of these approaches, but UI would be portable benefits, which would be more of a pooled system, you know, that Isaac Rubinoff thought about, so moving away from the Commons type system. I don't think Commons himself would have thought his system should exist forever. He was certainly a guy who realized that things change over time and there's evolution of working rules, and I think he would understand that. We have some countries where coverage is up to 70% of the workforce, whereas in the US, we only cover like 25% of the workforce really by UI. And so that's a significant problem that millions of people simply aren't even eligible. The US is pretty good on, say, minimum eligibility, but very poor on, say, maximum eligibility. So there's lots of factors like that. You could look at other countries to see where there are examples of things that might be different that could work better here. The second obvious option is statutory establishment. So here we could basically say the employer has a fiduciary duty to the employee, that we are co-equals. This could be up to including worker-run businesses, but it doesn't have to be that. In Germany, workers sit on the boards of corporations. That's even not necessarily under this. So you could have a change in the statutory roles where essentially the employer would have a duty to the employee. They couldn't discharge them so easily, and they would have to see ways to help that employee maintain that job, essentially. The challenge is legal enforcement. There would be costs where conflicts arise, obviously, and who bears the cost of that legal enforcement would be an important issue. Finally, I'm sure we've all heard of the federal job guarantees or universal basic income. A job guarantee seems like it might eliminate the need for unemployment insurance. It probably would mostly. There would be cost to these programs, but you could compare that to, the $600 billion we're paying for unemployment now. And, maybe a federal job guarantee could be actually a cheaper program in some cases. UBI is different. And, we heard, I think, at the Commons Veblen Awards speech about the dignity of work, and that UBI may or may not be an ideal policy, but it could be implemented at different levels, obviously, as well. So these policies are quite different, and probably more direct ways to assist people versus changing UI or changing the legal relationship, perhaps. So that's all I have, and thanks a lot. I appreciate your time.
Okay, thanks so much, Eric, for a great presentation, and also being right on time. Awesome. Okay, so next up is Antoon. You all set? Antoon, are you there?
You're muted right now.
Yeah, you'll need to unmute, Antoon. We got your screen. That's great.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Okay, take it away. You're all set.
Hello, good evening. At least here in the Netherlands, it is evening. For those in other time zone, good morning or good evening. My name is Antoon Spithoven, and I am an emeritus research fellow at the Utrecht University School of Economics. I will keep my presentation short. I have uploaded my files, so everybody has had the possibility to read my paper, and therefore I think that my presentation should be a refreshment of your memory. If you had not read my paper yet, my presentation might be an incentive to start reading it. I frame digital platformization of economies in Veblen's theory of evolution and Commons' concept of reasonableness. Digital platformization is the emergence of private and public internet firms which provide access for carrying out transactions by the combined use of software, hardware, and algorithms. Platformization challenges property rights. In addition to corporal and intangible value, digital data are value extracted from humans. Digital platformization resulted in a rise of jobs with poor social security provisions. First, I provide some theoretical notions regarding the interaction between technology and institutions. Then I provide a description of the political and social presence of libertarian economies. This description is followed with an examination of examples of social dislocation due to the platformization of economies. I continue with suggesting some policies to minimize social dislocation. I round off with a conclusion and discussion notes. According to Veblen, persons are institutionally and culturally embedded, while institutional, personal, and technological evolution endogenously evolve. Veblen argues that institutions embody the goals and aims of action. It is the inclusion of future in one's action that Veblen does not allocate a major role to deliberate decision-making in determining or shaping the institutional structure. Contrary to Veblen, Commons allocates a major role to collective, deliberate decision-making on institutions to shape present and future transactions. Commons qualifies the theological character of institutions as matching Darwinian evolutionary artificial selection of species. According to Commons, decision makers are formed by institutions, deliberate decisions are steered by protocols, and mission statements of social concerns are framed by cultures. Since the early 1970s, neoliberalism researched laissez-faire politics. Thatcher and Reagan are two main characters who enforced a breakthrough to a liberalization of markets. However, it is not only neoliberalism that influenced Thatcher and Reagan. Some catchy libertarian ideas of rent are embraced by Thatcher, respectively Reagan. Small government and free trade policies paved the way for the emergence of the digital platformization of the economy and changes the playing field between capital and labor in favor of capital. Rand's approach is especially pronounced on Wall Street and in Silicon Valley. On Wall Street, Rand's ideology is represented in the Goldman Rule. According to the Goldman Rule, everyone should pursue profitable opportunities regardless the effects on others. Defaulting subprime loans are a manifestation of the Goldman Rule. In Silicon Valley, internet platform operators and entrepreneurs are inspired by Rand. Silicon Valley is hailed as a place where people enjoy the American dream. Examples of upward financial mobility realized through the internet may suggest to be one of the promises of the American dream. However, there are caveats. For example, not everybody make it to a millionaire or billionaire through the pathway of hard work and education. Worsening of labor conditions started along with neoliberal and libertarian-inspired policies to change the institutional framework for temporary employing workers, whose share in the labor force is on the rise since the early 1980s. Although platform entrepreneurs are gradually adjusting to local regulations, labor circumstances and payment of gig work that is mediated via internet platforms leave still much to be desired. The substitution of regular jobs by gig jobs implies creation of jobs with poor social security provisions. An update of Commons reasonableness approach is required. Namely, notwithstanding that interests may conflict in the short term, interest might be addressed reasonably to balance short-term individual and long-term collective interests. New institutional conciliatory and deliberative tripartite or multipartite bodies might be required to effectuate collaboration on the new socio-economic challenges. Gig workers may become protected through legislation. Additionally, platform operators and platform owners should be held accountable and responsible for exploiting gig workers. Jobs with poor social security provisions and bigger income differentials are influenced by technological development. Technology did not determine them. Bad jobs and bigger income differentials are preceded and accompanied by a deliberate change in institutions that favor free markets. Representatives of stakeholders should have the power to control the economy. The regulation of digital properties concerns a simultaneous transition in economics, in psychology, in law, and in politics. In economics, there should be a transition to regulate control of providers of digital platforms, to enforce competition, to tax and to audit algorithms. In psychology, there should be a transition to a focus on profiling psychology. In law, there should be a transition to governance of computer-based algorithms. In politics, there should be a transition to rebalance sovereignty, globalization and democracy, and to regulate and assign data property rights, among which banning unnecessary tracking of what is looked at online. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Antoon, for a nice paper. Let's see. Next up, we have Scott Carson. Scott, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me? Because we were having a little bit of difficulties early on. How well can you hear me?
We can hear you, but the audio is poor.
Okay, I'm doing my best, and I apologize about that. So that's one of the nightmares of technology. And there's also the goods. So, but hopefully everyone can hear me as well as I hope that we can. Okay, so, and also sad because I spent quite a bit of time outside my window is a view of Mount Antoon, and just on the other side of that is Sundance Ski Resort. If you haven't heard, Robert Redford has sold the resort, but not the rights over like the catalog and the festival. So as we move forward, I particularly appreciate Eric's comments in terms of context on laws and lanes, concerns over access to resources and inequality. And of course, that's what's wedding all of these comments. So they're appreciated. So first off, this is a paper about biological inequality. You won't know, but I've over the last 20 years, really about 20 years ago to about 10 years ago. So I spent about 10 years collecting what through that time was the largest anthropometric data source in the US. And I looked at the participants, and I was particularly interested to see, I see Jim and John are here, but I was particularly interested to see if John Quantiles would show up this morning, because for those of you who know John, he's very much now into Trumpism and some of the issues on inequality. But his hallmark was the development of anthropometric measures, and he's done a tremendous, phenomenal amount of material. So hopefully I can get with him later. But what's going on here is we're looking at biological measures to think about inequality and standards of living. So larger picture, what we've done is with all these prison data, we have height, weight, and like BMI calculations. In the absence, so like in development economics, if you don't have good pecuniary and monetary measures for well, what's your alternative? Well, height, weight, biological measures are one alternative to reflect these measures, and nobody is more at the forefront than John Quantiles on this. So when I'm doing this,
Scott, I don't mean to interrupt. Audio is extremely poor, and I suspect nobody can really understand much of what you're saying. Maybe go ahead with Tim, and then work on connection.
Okay, is there somebody with ASSA that can work with me on this?
Yes, Lauren, are you there? Can you help Scott with this? I'm messaging Lauren.
Okay, then go with Tim then.
Might I suggest you want to turn off your speakers? That might fix it. You still there?
I am.
Yeah, I think the problem is the connection. It's not a feedback. There is a feedback issue, but that's secondary. Okay, I'm trying to get a hold of AFEE folks to help you out, Scott. Maybe we can switch over. Tim, are you there and ready to go?
I am.
Okay, wonderful. Let's do that.
Scott, you're going to have to mute or we're going to keep getting the echo. All right. Thank you all for being here, especially all the people who are in attendance. Let me share my screen. What I want to talk about today is the upcoming crisis that we all know is going to happen roughly in the year 2029. I'm predicting it exactly right now. So when the crisis comes, please be sure to credit me as the first person who saw it. It could be that I'm just guessing, thanks to Marx and Minsky, that the crises are inevitable in a capitalist system. But hey, I said it first, so I should get credit, I'm assuming. This paper is written to me in a sense of practicality. So if you're an individual on the right who thinks the system's self-correcting, or if you're on the left, which I lean more towards myself, that any kind of intervention is simply stopping us from getting to the ultimate outcome of the collapse of the system, this paper is really not for you. It's about a practical attempt to deal with the continuing boondoggles that we've been seeing during all of these crises. The standard mainstream response to crises is almost always the same. It's impossible for us to tell when the next Ponzi crisis is going to collapse. We don't know where it's going to happen. It may happen in an industrial sector. It's most likely going to happen in the finance sector. But wherever it happens, we always hear the same thing. One, nobody could have foreseen this, even though pretty much always, if you come to an AFEE meeting, everyone has foreseen it. Two, saving the institution is the only way to save the economy. Of course, that's always the thing. If you're the one who's going down, you've got to save the institution, save the economy. And of course, anyone who's in opposition to saving for-profit companies will be called naive. You're just too naive. There is no alternative. We have to save Goldman Sachs. And of course, the corporate media will completely and utterly reinforce this. They will say that this is what it is. And we've seen it, I don't know how many multiple times. It's like Groundhog Day almost, the movie. What we see is literally, it's a corporate socialist playbook. What we're living in is a corporate socialist society. People are talking about it, but the truth is that's what it is. We bail out our private companies about once every 7 or 8 years. What this paper is going to entail is we're going to talk quickly about a jobs guarantee, because institutionalists are usually pretty much in favor of jobs guarantee. We'll talk about how it's a powerful tool, but I don't think it's the only tool. And more importantly, politically, I don't think it's the tool you're going to see during the next crisis. So second, we're going to look at the 2020 boondoggles. I've got some interesting numbers there for you. I always like to present some interesting numbers in anything I do. And then I'm going to offer an alternative playbook. And the alternative playbook is something we've already started seeing just on the most recent bailout, where people are pushing for $2,000 per person. We'll talk about this as we go forward. Jobs guarantee. First thing, I think it's absolutely impressive that a jobs guarantee is actually being discussed seriously again. As Ray points out in his 2018 article, multiple 2020 presidential candidates are offering support to such a policy. That's an incredible shift. That's just, it's amazing to me that that's happening. Employer as last resort is a self-correcting program. It'd be nice to have such a situation in place, especially for the areas of the country where there is really economic desperation. A recent simulation showed that employer last resort could raise the economy by 500 billion, create 19 million new jobs with about a 0.74 percentage points above the baseline of inflation. That seems to me to be some pretty solid evidence that an ELS, or a job guarantee, is a good idea. But this has not been an uncontested concept. Not everyone's on board. So you've got different people, as I quote right there, who talk about this. We had in the JEI, not last, I don't think it's Sawyer, I can't remember. Sorry, I've got a misquote there and I don't know exactly what it is. But you had in 2003, 2005, a pretty big conflict in JEI between different peoples who were in favor of the employer of last resort. And you can look at my paper, I've got the right citations there, but that I don't think is right. And there are people who are still opposed to it now, and they've got good reasons. And I think there is something to be said about not necessarily the negativity of having an employer of last resort, but implementation could be incredibly problematic. For example, a lot of the policies I've seen have said we should organize it on a local level. And I agree, a local level is the best way to do it. But I get fears of certain regions of the country really abusing this situation, especially when you see the history of Jim Crow, or even if you go back to Britain, to workhouses. But this paper is not about a jobs guarantee. Ultimately, my favor is I think we should have a jobs guarantee. If it's done likely, it'll help both workers and business if it's done well. Problem is that jobs guarantee, it's not that a jobs guarantee can't work, it's that politically getting it implemented is going to be incredibly hard. And importantly, an attempt to pass and implement such a program during a crisis would make a complex process into potentially a flawed process that could discredit the entire ELR for decades. If you're going to do a jobs guarantee, if you're going to change the institutional structure of the United States, you got one chance, you got one shot. You blow it, you're talking about decades where people are just going to reject the entire idea. So I'm not sure trying to implement it during a massive national economic crisis is the way to go. It should obviously be pushed for, but it should not be sold as the program that's going to solve the crisis. So what I'm saying is the arguments aren't against the technical ability for the program to work. It's the political exigencies of what we're talking about. And it's not just me who says there's some problems of doing this. You can look at Mitchell and Ray in their 2005 piece, and they talk about you're going to have to phase it in over time. You're going to have to come up with it. And so I'll try to imagine to put the jobs guarantee to work during our current epidemic. It's not the solution that's going to work. So it could deal with a lot of the problems. This is absolutely true, but getting it passed would be problematic, and a push to do it along with other policies needs to come together. You need to have both other policies that affect the short-term pains that people feel during an economic crisis, as well as the long-term dealing with the systemic problems that a job guarantee could help. But let's face it, during this crisis or the next crisis, the job guarantee is going to be talked about. But the real thing, what you're seeing is these crises isn't about helping people, it's about helping corporations. So here's some numbers. The US government spent $5.8 trillion on stimulus since 2008, 5.8 trillion. During the Great Recession, it was about 2.8 trillion. As of December 7th, I'm not including the most recent round, the US government issued another $3 trillion in stimulus. To put those numbers in context, that's enough to give every person in the US $17,672. Every single person, man, woman, and child. With an average household of 2.5 people, that means the government could have given every household $44,180. My research on debt my research on household debt, that would put a big chunk of debt out of the way for most US households. It could have been an incredible use of that money. Instead, the actual government policy over the two crises was to give $1,500 in direct aid to adults and $3,250 direct aid to households. That's for both crises. In other words, the supermajority of all this aid has gone to non-households. It's gone to businesses and banks and corporate firms. It should be noted here that this isn't even including the hidden subsidies going out from the Federal Reserve. You're talking about a huge amount of money, not a small amount, a huge amount of money. Let's talk about the most recent one, the Paycheck Protection Program. I love this one. It sounds so great. Protecting the paychecks. I mean, how can you be against that? And it's to small businesses. Of course, it was neither. When we look at the number, as of 2018, there are roughly 5.2 million small businesses that are employed 1 to 20 employees. And I think that's a really better definition compared to what the government used, which is 500 employees, 1 to 20 employees, which means if you take that $5.2 billion, you could give around $100,000 to every small business with employers under 20 people. That's a lot of money. According to the SBA, 20 million people work in businesses with less than 20 employees, which means the US government could have given $26,000 in direct employee compensation for every employee working in a small business. Let that sink in. That's way more than our current minimum wage. That's if you really wanted to do it. Instead, the government extended the small businesses to 500 employees, made the program into a complicated loan program with loan forgiveness options, and decided the program should be run through the private banking system. This is in part a banking bailout, a banking subsidy. That's what this was. The result was that the top 1% of PPP loans were given out to a quarter or top 1% of businesses, big businesses got a quarter of the loans, and the top 5% counted for overall half the loans. Of course, that's the case. They intended that to be the case. That's why they made it complicated, so that the big connected businesses could get this money. You know, look at the Trump family who got it, or the preachers who got it, who aren't even in tax, who are tax exempt, right? Now, just to put this in context, suppose you did want to keep it at the 500 person level. There's 59.8 million employees working at firms with less than 500 employees. That subsidy would have been $8,800 per employee if you're just given the money directly to employees. You can even give it through the firms so that the firms have to keep them employed. But $8,800, it's a lot of money. It's a half a year's pay. Probably would have been more effective to give it directly as a subsidy to these workers. Give it through the business, whatever. Let's talk about the airlines. $25 billion and another $25 billion in loans. To put it in context, the top 6 US airlines, that's December of 2019, was worth a market capitalization of $114 billion. The BLS reports as of May 2019, there were 498,830 people. What does that mean? The government gave airlines roughly $50,000 in grants per employee for a promise of layoffs for no more than 4 months. And as soon as the bill went up, they started laying off people left and right. $50,000 per employee. The average annual salary for transport employees at the same report was $78,000. So the US government paid over 60% of the airline's entire yearly payroll to get a guarantee of 1/3 of a year without layoffs. Interesting side note. The market valuation of the top 6 US airlines dropped from $114 billion in 2019 to $52.6 billion in May of 2020. In other words, the bailout was as big as the market capitalization for the airlines. Why didn't we just buy up the dang airlines? Because that would be anti-capitalistic somehow. Maybe it's just me. I get frustrated by these things. Why don't we instead send the aid to the people? Those corporate socialist solutions will continue unless there's a concerted effort made by opponents against the programs. Opposition to these future corporate slush funds should push laws that would make such boondoggles harder to implement. We need to use an individualistic narrative. As much as I know many here don't like the individual narrative, we want to get away from this capitalist ideology. It's there. It's how you win in American politics. We should require, and we should as individuals, support politicians who are going to come out and say, supplemental aid needs to be granted to biological individuals, not corporate individuals, not individuals as defined by the Supreme Court. Tie it to biological individuals, and you should be able to place a name on every one of the recipients who gets it. In other words, if you're going to give aid, there has to be a name. So if you give aid, ultimately aid to for-profit firms should be opposed, and programs to design help for groups should only be to nonprofit groups in state and local governments. We should not be helping for-profit firms. Oh, we got to help these small businesses.
Hey, Tim, you're at about 4 minutes.
Thank you. Should be fine. Should we help these small firms? I don't know. I don't see why that's part of what capitalism is. Emergency money going to for-profit enterprise should be ridiculed and opposed as socialist interference in the markets. We should be using the language these capitalists and these individual business owners have used for 40 years to talk to the people about how socialism is bad. We should use their language, show that capitalism requires these purges, and bankruptcy is the market equivalent of decomposition and fertilization. We should show that companies cannot survive on their own, should be ushered into bankruptcy, and the lieners, owners, and the people who are loaning money should be dispossessed under the bankruptcy rules that exist. Companies that are critical to the well-being of the country should be brought under bankruptcy protection, and the government should maintain the continued running of those companies until they can be reprivatized to new owners, managers through new public offerings. And these can be even to the point where you are reprivatizing them to workers' co-ops. At the same time, public offerings of large firms should be broken into smaller firms to increase competition. The idea that we should be selling firms to each other, such as mergers during this, should be opposed as creating monopoly power. Let's bring back the discussion of markets. If people want markets, let's have some. When the airlines need to be privatized again, break them into 7 or 10 airlines. Laws that conform to this type of government stewardship should be proposed now so that during the next crisis, the bankruptcies can occur under a set of known rules. Direct subsidies to individuals and households should be the emphasis. The opponents of corporate socialism should emphasize that they are the pro-market, pro-family option during these times of crisis. Steal the ground that has been laid. Finally, we need to create political groups that can raise money to spend on campaigns against politicians who support these corporate boondoggles. Politicians to continue to create and adopt policies that enable large corporate boondoggles must be forced to pay a political price. This group should be the political face of a movement to force for-profit enterprises to face the consequences of a capitalist system. As a society, we must stop socialism for wealthy and rugged individualism for everyone else. It's time for capitalists to face the consequences of capitalism. That's my paper. Hopefully y'all enjoy it. You can read it sometime, hopefully. Hey, there we go. And I am going to stop sharing my screen in just a second. Hey. Stop share. There it is. Sorry about that. There you go. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Awesome. And last up, Scott, how you doing?
You tell me. Can you hear me better?
A little bit. We'll see how it goes. We'll see how it goes. Your screen. And if you could follow, ASSA is giving you direction in the chat function too.
Okay. I turn the volume on, and it tells me to unmute. So that's
okay. Now we can't hear you at all. So I think maybe only talk on your phone and have all other volumes down might be the way to go.
His phone is currently muted. I don't know if you can unmute the phone.
Can't. I can only ask him to unmute.
Unmuted the phone.
Yeah, don't mute the phone. Don't mute your phone.
Okay. It's unmuted. My phone is unmuted. Star 6. Does that work better?
Yes, now mute your computer and you should be good.
Bad echo.
Okay. Now, does that work?
Perfect.
I don't hear
Awesome.
any of you.
Yep,
Okay.
clear.
Whew.
Clear. Crystal
Wow. We're doing a lot this morning. Okay. So I don't know what you heard earlier, but I've looked through the participants. I've hoped that John Comlos would be able to show up this morning. I don't know if any of you have followed what John has done. He's been talking about Trumpism and some of the inequalities and problems with capitalism. But before he got into his current research agenda, he was prolific in the area of anthropometrics, which is what we're discussing today. I haven't seen that John's here, which is a little bit of a disappointment. So, but before we proceed, in terms of technology, I tried very hard to make sure that we'd have the vision so you could see outside my window, which is a picture of Timpanogos, which is actually right now being engulfed by clouds, which is where Robert Redford is. And if you haven't heard, he's sold Sundance, the rights to Sundance, the ski resort, but not the catalog or the film festival. So Robert Redford's always been concerned about some of these progressive policies and inequality. So I appreciate Eric's comments regarding context, the unemployment laws, and Lane, I also appreciate your comments regarding access and the original allegation of power and property rights and how they feed into inequality, which is where we're going this morning. So what are we going to talk about in terms of my discussion? I need to get to share screen, and you should see at this point my slideshow.
Yep, we see it. Awesome, great.
Okay, thank you. That's the feedback I need to have, and it's quite reassuring. Okay, so this is a measure of anthropometrics. If you aren't familiar with anthropometrics in terms of material accumulation and inequality is the use of biological measures in developing societies and historically to tie to material inequality. So you can think in terms of a biological, if you will, income statement. So you have calories coming in from your nutrition, you have calories coming in from your diet, and the quality of calories and the quantity of calories is vital in that sense. On the other side, there are calories out. So it's revenue in minus revenue out. And the difference is how well you're doing in your society. So the average of all of them. Individually, it's not as good as measure as overall the averages. So if we look at the averages over time, we can have a better understanding on how well an economic system is doing. By characteristics, we can get a better idea on how well individuals are doing. So why, of course, is this important? Well, in terms of development studies, in terms of historical economics, we're talking about health and inequality. And that's what this study is getting to. I've only found one other developing study that uses, by Jörg Batten, that uses biological measures to assess inequality, but that is in terms of development studies. This is the first I've seen in terms of historical inequality. So what we're going to do is we're going to use biological measures to determine how current and cumulative biological measures vary by characteristics. And then we're going to use these measures to determine how current and cumulative biological measures were distributed, not just how they accumulated, but how they were distributed by characteristics and over time. Then we're going to use biological measures to determine how current and accumulative measures varied across their respective distributions. Okay. So just in terms of knowing what these three measures are, BMI is a measure of weight in kilograms to height in meters squared. And it is a measure for current net nutrition, today's nutrition. Whereas stature, it's the same biological income statement. It's measured in centimeters in this study and all the studies I've worked with. And it's going to be a measure for cumulative, over the life course, how well are things going. So that's the difference between BMI and weight and ultimately stature. So that's what we're talking about today. So overall, a big part of my discussion and how I'm framing this, and if you have any additions, augments to it, I'm very much wanting to hear from you. We're looking at how, specifically, we'll start with BMI, because that's a popular thing in the literature, in popular culture. BMI is a popular thing that we can think about. So BMI is going to be modeled as a function of wealth and inequality. So W, wealth, and inequality. So the greater the wealth, the smaller the additional contributions, or there's going to be a negative relationship between wealth inequality at certain levels. However, there will be a positive relationship between BMI and wealth, the level. You have a higher wealth, historically, you're going to devote it to calories consumed. That's why these BMI biological measures I find are so convenient and useful, is because before you had these measures, monetary pecuniary, your highest priority in development was, can I get enough food to eat? And so that first part is, that first part on the left-hand side of the change in BMI for change in wealth will be a direct effect on nutrition, whereas the right-hand side, the change in BMI for change in inequality, for the change in inequality for the change in wealth, will be an indirect effect. Many times that second part, BMI inequality, that relationship will be negative for the reasoning we just went through in terms of the marginal contributions. Next issue, like we've said, this is the largest anthropometric data set in the United States, up at least through the last couple of years. Now, there are some places in South Carolina that are collecting, replicating. Well, there are three things. One in South Carolina is trying to do what I've done with this data set. And then in November of 2019, I had Hamish Maxwell Stewart at the University of Tasmania, and then Chris Inwood at University of Guelph in Canada. Both independently came to me and said they're doing the same thing with their prison records to document them and do the same thing I've done here. So it's still evolving. But from this data set, there's a tremendous number of historical females. If you look at that, you're at 4,500, 4,600 females. There's nothing close to this. But then you've got 172,000 males. Males are easy to come by. You can get them from prison records. You can get them from military records. But prison records have done the best for having both height and weight. But so what we're seeing first off, women have higher BMIs historically than men. And we'll talk about why that is and how it's distributed in just a moment. But then we can also look through race, complexion, African-American, Mexican, mulatto, or mixed race, and whites. We have these, and across the board, even though Clemson was recently defeated, Howard Bodenhorn at Clemson has claimed that taller statures for whites is because during the 19th century was simply because of racial prejudice and 19th century social preferences. That's not well supported by what we're seeing right here and across the board. African Americans, individuals with darker complexions consistently biologically have higher BMIs. Medically, physiology, there's greater protein and muscle mass for individuals with darker complexions. And so we can see that we see this ubiquitous issue of darker complexions having greater, higher BMIs. I don't want to spend too much time on the received effect. We'll proceed past that. Occupations. In terms of occupations, people with no occupations during this period, virtually everyone is tied to agriculture in some capacity. So my sense is that many of those folks who said they had no occupations, the best approximation for their occupation would have been agriculture. Unskilled would have been similar, and skilled folks would have the lowest BMIs. And that's completely within at least my expectations. Looking at ages and BMIs, these measures, you have this nonlinear effect. But the thing I'm really going to be interested in is down here at older ages, you don't lose weight. Over here is weight. You don't lose weight as fast as you do for height. Okay. Okay. So, and then I'm not going to worry on that point. But the overall picture for the descriptive statistics is from the sample, unskilled white males in their 20s received between the 1920s, 1890s, and the 1910s. They're the most common. The most common immigrant group is from Europe, continental Europe, and the South within the US is the most common nativity within the sample. Now, in terms of biological markers of BMIs, height and weight, women, African American, no occupation from Europe had the highest BMIs. That's not necessarily because they're in better nutrition, simply because of the construct of BMI that we saw just a moment ago. Weight divided by height squared means that height is going to have a big weight, a big influence on BMIs. And since women and going further, African Americans on average during this period are shorter, they're going to have higher BMIs, okay? Additionally, white skilled males in their 20s and 30s, you reach maximum stature at about 23, and then afterward, it's all falling apart. But it's not perceptible until you're getting into your 70s. Okay, then the last compositional for the summary statistics is weight largely follows BMIs, and that follows from in the results that follow here. Now, just quickly, we're going to consider two inequality measures. First is going to be the coefficient of variation, where we're going to take the standard deviation of the IT group and divide it by the mean of that group. And then also the Gini coefficient, both the CB coefficient variation and Gini coefficient. Higher values represent greater inequality, lower values greater equality. Okay, inextricably tied to the Gini coefficient is the Lorenz curve. Now, so this is the Lorenz curve for blacks, whites, males, and females. On the left is females, on the right is males. So we see females, the more bowed out you are, the 45-degree line is that line of perfect equality, whereas the bowed out line, the Lorenz curve, is the measure of inequality. The more bowed out it is, the less equal the distribution of resources. We see right here, females have greater inequality than males. But if we look at stature, stature is normally distributed, just biologically, whatever factors that cause it to occur. And having the Lorenz line up on the 45-degree line say that there's pretty close to perfect equality when it comes to stature. Why? It's determined genetically, so you can't get around it. So the environmental conditions for the distribution will be for stature exactly what we see. Now, there are two folks in anthropometrics. It really comes out of the 1993 Nobel Prize winner, Bob Fogel, with his study Time on the Cross for American Slavery. He's the first who brought it out into economics, but his two graduate students at the time were John Komlos and Rick Steckel. So Rick Steckel and I were talking in Chicago at the Social Science History Association meetings, and we both, I agree, and Rick, as I would say, one of the godfathers of anthropometrics, he also agrees the best measures for inequality will be for current net nutrition, and that therefore BMI inequality here, and BMI inequality for, weight inequality here. So we're seeing that women have greater inequality throughout history. So just in terms of summary, stature is genetically distributed and follows a normal distribution. So we've already seen that. Next issue, BMI and weight are more plastic, genetically do not follow this normal distribution, and they probably provide a better measure for stature, inequality, and net nutrition. Number 3, from BMI and weight Lorenz curves, this is something that's new, and I wasn't expecting this, is that women have greater inequality than men. I was thinking initially maybe women would have had greater equality because they have a greater sense of common purpose or whatever. Not so. Why? My sense, childbearing, 1. The number of women who have children versus the number of women who don't have children, those women who have great children are more likely to have a greater disparity in BMIs and net nutrition just biologically, okay? But then also, not just the number that you have children, but the number of children that you have. We're not going to get that information. Historically, that information is just not going to exist, and it's going to have to remain largely speculation. All right, so the next topic.
Hey, Scott, you heard about
looking. Okay, that's we can get to it quickly. Okay, so I'm going to skip this. This says much what we just said. When we look at across groups, the only thing we're really seeing is that folks from Latin America and Mexico, they have greater inequality, they have greater equality, but at the same time, their biological measures are smaller. So what we're saying is you distribute resources equally amongst Mexican groups, Latin American groups, but it's much lower. The other groups are open more to debate. Skipping through quickly. What I really want to get to, this is going to be the relationship between measurements in a simple, I'm not using a regression model, I'm using a standardized student T's or student standardized coefficient regression model, because it's not clear what the measurement is for a Gini. So I opt for a standardized coefficients model. And it gives me the results I expect. The largest contributor to inequality is stature, which is genetically distributed, and you can't really say much in terms of redistribution of wealth in those terms, but in terms of occupation Gini coefficients. Then we can also in a moment talk about age Gini coefficients. So the next question I have is, using a quantile estimator, the previous table tells me how resources are, how biological measures are related to the distribution of resources at the center of the conditional distribution. That's saying how characteristics influence biological measures. The next question is, well, how do we hear very much about the obesity epidemic? That has to do with the distribution of BMIs. So what I have here is a quantile estimator. And so if I had more time, we'd look at the distribution of BMIs and weight. They're pretty close to symmetric, pretty clumpy. If anything, they're going to be a little positively skewed, whereas today they're a little bit more on the negatively skewed side. So this picture is the returns to characteristics across the distribution. So what we're saying here for BMIs is for centimeters, in terms of height, taller people, just as we'd expect because of the construction of BMI, they have a greater negative effect. But otherwise, and this is a key point for the next couple slides, what we see is across the distribution, it's primarily the case that as you get closer to the right-hand tail of the distribution, go back to that Slutsky's equation we started with. The positive effect of the relationship, if I eat more calories, I have higher BMI. If I eat more calories, I have a taller stature. If I eat more calories, I have greater weight. That direct effect of weight is offsetting the inverse negative marginal because of the last dollar consumed in a population. Okay, so you can't see much. Stature, in terms of inequality, it doesn't give you a lot of information. It's of all of the measures, it's pretty stationary. It's not, when you look at it with the numbers, I'm just giving you the pictures in the table. I give you the regression tables and statistics. In the case of stature, it's not very informative. but in terms of weight and BMI both, they're quite reflective, and they're saying, going back to that Slutsky's equation, is that the direct effect of weight accumulation dominates and offsets the negative marginal contributions across the distribution. So, what have we said? Why is this important? One, women's biological inequality was greater than men. And this is likely associated with childbirth and the number of children. Number two, stature was a statistically significant contributor to BMI and weight inequality. And like, this is the important thing, like wealth inequality, biological measures increased with age because characteristics associated with inequality, they increased with age. And the last thing is, returning to the indirect inequality trade-off from the Slutsky equation, across distribution, BMIs increased at higher race, time, gender, socioeconomic status, and regional inequality, meaning the positive relationship dominated in that case, and greater net nutrition dominated the inverse effects between nutrition and inequality for these characteristics. Other than that, that's my discussion. So I'll turn it back to Tomas, and I appreciate your attention.
Okay, thanks so much, Scott, and thanks for bearing with everybody to work out the various technical details. We do have time available for Q&A. All of our speakers are still here and available. I'm monitoring both the Q&A as well as the chat function, both of which is open. And I believe ASSA support, if you're still online, we were able to modify this so that people asking questions would be able to be seen. Is that correct? Okay, I'm not seeing any questions at the moment. While people sort of put their thoughts together on this, if other panelists would wish to ask questions of each other, I think that would be appropriate at this point.
Yes, you can hear me?
Absolutely, Antoon.
Yes, I have a question for Scott. I was puzzling how age is playing a role in your analysis, because when children are overweight at a really young age, they will stay overweight when they grow older. And so there's a lag between income and their BMI. So I don't know how you untangle the current nutrition and the cumulative nutrition. Can you say something about that?
Yes, I can, and I appreciate you bringing that up. First of all, if we look more at the characteristic description, we're looking at about age 14, and so it's not going to be very young ages. They're not going to be in prison. The youngest individual in the prison that I found is like 9 years old, but you can't really use that one or two observations. So the number of children is restricted, and you're looking for individuals 12 and 14 and above. But your point is also well taken in the sense of the way we calculate and use BMI for children and adolescents is, if you look at the World Health Organization, you use the distribution of the overall sample, and you binarily just say if you were below the 95, or if you're just the 5th quantile, then your BMI is underweight or overweight. So the way children are, so the answer is, one, there aren't a lot of children in the sample, and then two, the way BMIs are calculated for children have to be handled differently.
Thank you.
Did you hear that, or was I muted?
Nope, nope. We heard you loud and clear, Scott. Thanks.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Still no questions from the audience that I can see at any rate. So please, if you're asking questions and I'm not seeing them, please message me. But I'm not seeing any right now. Any other questions for our panelists? If not, I have one. But I want everybody else to give a chance first.
Well, I have one too. So.
Okay. Well, I think Lane, maybe you better go ahead then.
Okay, well, you know, we've all had spoken in different areas, and I would just like to ask, like, what is your one sort of policy recommendation, or policy area that you would like to focus on going forward with what you've studied? I think I know it. I mean, I think I've got it pretty well from Tim, but for the rest of you, I would. I mean, I'd like to hear from you too, but certainly from the rest of you.
As you said, I think my policy one is quite clear. My whole thing is about policy, so I'll let others speak.
Mine's historical, and so in terms of policy, it's harder, in my opinion, to make those projections, but what it does say, I think, in this study, is that there are certain biological characteristics, inequality things that are baseline that you can't get away from. On the other side of that, that doesn't mean that policy is not valuable. That means that you just have to take that as a baseline and move forward from there. That's what I gain from what I've considered.
This is Eric. Yeah, I think Tim's discussion really stimulated a lot of thinking for me, but I was thinking about the fact that not only did we not buy the airlines, but we, essentially are probably going to have fewer flights, fewer airlines, and prices will likely go up. So there's like all these spin-on effects that are going to impact the economy and people's welfare for a long period to come. I'm sure there'll be less access to flights in smaller communities, and so it's kind of interesting. I mean, there's so many other knock-on effects even from, and I think I liked his idea of corporate socialism, and using that language I think is so critical, because when I studied the Detroit bankruptcy in 2014, it was the same story of how language is used to shape the narratives and really the outcomes of court cases and so forth. So I find that a really interesting area to continue to think about.
Okay, I've been asked to read one of the questions that was in the Q&A out loud. It's Paolo Ramanazzi says, I think I mangled your name, Paolo. My apologies. This question was to, correct me if I'm wrong, but since I believe you did not mention in your presentation, I wonder if you took account of K.W. Knapp's contribution to institutionalist theory of social costs. And whomever answered that, if they could answer that, I can't see the answer.
Yeah, that was me. Yes, I did. I actually had a one sentence in the larger paper directly related to that. I think Capps, The Social Cost of Private Enterprise, was just a wonderful book. And I read it a long time ago in like 1962. And it really opened a lot of doors for me. So, I was trying to think about external economies at the beginning of diseconomies and so forth at the beginning of graduate school. And this was very positive learning experience for me, trying to think through all this stuff for the first time. So I did have a sentence in my original article. The rich sentence, I might as well just read it. In a heterodox analysis, K. William Cap, 1950, refers to such harmful situations, various kinds of harm that are done by cost-benefit analysis, refers to such harmful situations as social costs, and shows the tendency of private enterprise to transfer these costs to workers and the public. So that, that was my sort of counterposition to external diseconomies. They were just putting them on people.
Okay, thanks for the response on that. Any other questions for the panelists? Okay, well, I'm going to ask my question then, and I guess this is mostly to maybe Eric, but others who have made specific policy recommendations. You know, in your work, what have been sort of the successful strategies that you've employed to actually modify either legislation or social policy? As somebody who's worked in this area quite a bit, I'm often very frustrated by putting policy forward and then you know, not necessarily being ignored, but sort of taking maybe the least desirable aspects of the policy I was advocating and applying that, and kind of leaving all the rest by the wayside, resulting in something that might even be worse than what was there before.
Yeah, and I'll just speak from my experience. I've worked in state and local government. I have not worked at the federal level, but I think to Tim's ideas about what is possible, I mean, I've worked in both the executive and legislative branches of government. And yeah, it's challenging because ultimately compromise is sort of the reality you kind of end with. And I've learned a lot from reading Commons of kind of how he went through a lot of this as well. And maybe you end up with policies less than ideal. My work has been more on public finance and municipal finance specifically, but what I have learned also is getting people to recognize there's a problem is a pretty big issue. A lot of times they don't even want to recognize a problem. So in Lansing, where I live and have worked at the state government, part of the work is just getting people to say, oh, there is a problem. Okay, so maybe we should work together to find solutions. And that's harder and harder today. In Michigan, our legislature is extremely difficult to work with now, honestly. And I have friends on both sides of the aisle. Even some of my neighbors are politicians. And but I've tried my best, you know, as an institutional economist, to kind of bring that thinking to bear as much as I can and move the agenda where I can help. But I do think, unfortunately, the shift is continually to the right and to the conservative side. And so it gets harder and harder because the middle ends up being more and more to that side. And so, yeah, I've worked on things like public pension policy and think we've done a little bit of good perhaps, but yeah, I would agree. It's a tough road right now because in our political climate, compromise or even working together is seen as a negative most of the time. And so, to Tim's thing about corporate socialism, I mean, I think that even happens at the state level. I mean, it clearly happens at the federal level on a massive scale, but at the state level, it's happening too, where they're giving tax breaks to large corporations and they control the system. When I was deputy treasurer, I would have many corporations coming to me and lobbying for different things. And I had to, you know, they would actually write the legislation. I mean, people don't realize legislators don't actually write legislation anymore. Like lobbyists write it and hand it to you and say, can you pass this? And it was kind of eye-opening. I mean, I certainly fought back against a lot of that personally. Didn't mean it didn't get passed, obviously, but yeah, it's a fascinating process. I have a lot of political science colleagues who help me understand this better because as an economist, we're not always attuned to some of these things. But yeah, I've learned a lot, and I've kind of tried to be inspired by Commons to sort of think about how to be a practitioner and an academic. And, you know, currently I'm working for the mayor of Flint, and as well as working at MSU, and I've learned at the local level, it's the same thing, you know, a lot of the same challenges. And so a community like Flint that's been impacted by neoliberalism, its water system poisoned, its economy destroyed. But I find, just in a final note, for me, institutional economics gives me some hope to help make a difference still. So you know, as naive as that may be at times, but you know, I do. So I appreciate AFEE and keeping me going in these difficult circumstances.
When I look at policy, most of my papers are policy, and you ask how I get them implemented. I throw them out there. I was actually super excited that the president's, or Dublin Commons, Deb Figard quoted me on my universal child stipend. This should be a freaking no-brainer. A universal child stipend, people are like, oh, universal basic income or a jobs guarantee. Okay, kids can't have jobs. Huge popularity for universal basic income. You got a natural working experiment. You know, I'm hoping something like that'll pick up. And the fact that at least one person has read the paper makes me happy. You know, I think as economists, if we're not doing something to suggest changes, what are we doing? I mean, are we just sitting here contemplating our navels? In which case, maybe we should go work in some other field and do something that's productive. I think policy is ultimately what we should be as institutionalists offering. But how to get it done? I don't know. Use the language of the people. That's why I suggest when we frame the next thing, we talk about it as markets and all this other stuff that, you know, our language, who cares? But if we can get that language out there, if we can get people to understand that this is the way you want to go by using their language, because all of my papers talk about how do we frame this so that we can get not just the liberals who will love it or the whatever, but so we can get that person in the street realize, oh, this will help me. Because frankly, I hate to say it, that's what people are looking for. If you go to the conservative chat boxes out there, like Reddit conservative, they're pissed that they didn't get the $2,000. They're torqued. The libertarians, they're like, why are we giving all this money? It's like this broad consent out there that the current policies suck. And, you know, for the first time, Pelosi and the Democrats were able to pick up on it and go, oh, look, people are popular. I mean, come on. If you start doing stuff that makes people realize, hey, you're giving them stuff, you're going to gain political support, you're going to be able to move forward. But we can't do that unless we can speak the language of the average person. And that means us as economists, we have to speak that language. So I think that's the first thing for getting policies done, is to speak the language that the, you know, average person will speak, and swear every now and then, dang it.
Excuse me. Any other panelists wish to address that question? I'll just quickly, so the question, of course, was, you know, how do we actually get these things done? How do we make legislative change? And of course, I'll also agree that I take great solace in reading comments on sort of the meat grinder, as it were, of getting stuff done. And you know, people are interested in that kind of work. I would really encourage some of the lesser, because it's not really widely discussed in like institutional economics or legal foundations. It's more is lesser known works. It's you know, as somebody who's been an elected official and been a regulator, and it's really a challenge. So any other thoughts or comments on that? All right, wonderful.
Everyone contact your congressman and tell him universal child stipend. I mean, maybe if enough congressmen hear it from economists, they'll start going, hey, maybe this is an idea.
Okay, well, I'm not seeing any more questions. We do have 20 folks here in attendance besides the panelists and everybody, right? And that's about where we've been throughout most of this. So I guess everybody's very quiet, and that's okay. But if there's no other questions or other comments that folks would like to make in conclusion, I think we'll wrap this up. We do have about 9 minutes left before they hard out shut this all off. So if there's any final comments, I'd allow that from the panelists, but otherwise we'll call it quits. Any last thoughts?
I would just add also Elizabeth Brandeis's book, Our Unemployment Story, is a little hard to find, but has a really good description of how they went through the whole process of getting unemployment insurance passed at the federal level during the New Deal. I would recommend that as something to think about policy.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And that reminds me, who I can't remember which one of Common's students was so heavily involved in Social Security, but he also has a great book that he wrote about the process of getting Social Security passed.
I think a good book, a more recent one, is Galbraith's Predator State. I live in Arlington, Texas. I've lived here for, 12 years. And I did a calculation. We've got a 0.1% sales tax in Arlington to fund first the Ranger Stadium, the original Ranger Stadium. Then that was extended because it was supposed to be a 7-year tax. They extended it to create the Cowboy Stadium. And just as it was about to go out, the Rangers decided they needed a new stadium, right? And this is in a town where we have Republicans talking about the government shouldn't be interfering with everything. I had a colleague who was leaving where I teach now because he didn't get tenure because he wrote a paper about how funding for stadiums never pays back. It was weird how that, even though he was in quote top journals and stuff, he didn't get tenure when he said that. Just happened to be in the town where they were doing the policies. It was very bizarre. I don't know if there's any connection there or anything about meat grinder and getting stuff done, but I thought it was an interesting story.
Yeah, so quickly to close on that, it's Dr. Brent McClintock told me, correctly reminded me, it's Edwin Witte, W-I-T-T-E, of course, Social Security. Yeah, that's another great one about, he spent a lot of time going through the brutal process of getting that done.
There was a really good book about Wisconsin politics written really recently that I can't remember the author, honestly, but he actually talks about commons, but he talks about how the fall of Wisconsin, that's it. That's the title. I don't remember the author's name, but it's actually a pretty interesting book because Wisconsin being so progressive and now has reverted to a very different type of politics, at least until recently. And that's actually a really good book to think about these issues. Yeah, there's probably a number of newer ones now with the Trumpism and so forth. But I will say, honestly, one thing to be careful of, the social media has created a whole new set of challenges for those of us in policy, because you can end up being attacked or, you know, there are new things out there to go against you if you are on the perceived wrong side of something. Especially locally, people can find out who you are, where you are. Just a note that's quite different maybe than what was true 50 or 100 years ago, perhaps. There's a more personal nature to it. I've certainly found that at times. So yeah, just something to note, that if you do get in the policy world, it can be hard knocks at times. So.
All right, well, we're getting pretty close to the wrap up time, so I think it's better to end on that note.
Thank you, Tom.
So thanks everybody for a wonderful panel.
Everyone.
And there's a little bit of AFEE left, ASSA AFEE left. So have a wonderful rest of the conference, and I'll hope to see all of you in person next year. So keep your fingers crossed, everybody. Cheers. Take care.
Cheers.
See ya.
Take care.